Are you Neville Chamberlain? Or will you be Winston Churchill, who worked tirelessly to warn and prepare Britain for what was coming and told the House of Commons in 1936, the era of procrastination, of half measures, of soothing and baffling expedients, of delays is coming to its close. In its place, we are entering a period of consequences.
With a PhD in physics from MIT and experience as an Assistant Secretary of Energy, Joe Romm has become a leading voice for climate science with his blog, Climate Progress, where he regularly destroys the claims of climate deniers and disinformers.
The consequences are here now, just as climate scientists predicted.
But if you think he saves his fire for just one side of the aisle, then you don't know Joe. You've been critical of the Obama administration and their climate activities. We have a new administration, and they've unexpectedly put climate on the front burner, it would seem. So what are we to make of that?
What Obama said in the second inaugural address surprised a great many people, including myself.
We will respond to the threat of climate change, knowing that the failure to do so would betray our children and future generations.
He was blunt, and he spoke at length on climate for a relatively short address. So he's now created expectations. And the first big decision will be the Keystone XL tar sands pipeline, probably this spring. It would be very hard to reconcile his strong word with approving the pipeline. I mean, he put it in moral terms, which I think, I certainly try to do on Climate Progress. He said failure to act would betray our children and future generations. And those are the terms it should be put in. Keystone is a gateway to one of the dirtiest pools of carbon in the world, and it's very clear from pretty much all independent analysis, including very credible bodies like the International Energy Agency, that we have to leave most of the carbon in the ground if we're not going to destroy the climate for our children and future generations.
Did the president send a signal with his nomination of John Kerry for Secretary of State?
Yeah, Kerry is probably the most outspoken person on climate change in the U.S. Senate, and the most outspoken person in the Senate since Al Gore. So it is very hard to believe that John Kerry wants his first major act as Secretary of State to be signing off on something that the top climatologists in the country called, game over for the climate.
So a price on carbon, carbon tax or cap and trade?
Well, I don't think we're going to see the big piece of legislation anymore, and that may not just be on carbon. I think, I think there's a reluctance to do the very big piece of legislation. I think cap and trade got demonized. Ironically, cap and trade was basically a Republican, idea. It was Herbert Walker Bush used it in the Clean Air Act amendments for dealing with sulfur acid rain pollution. The environmentalists embraced it because they thought because it was more business friendly and sort of a moderate Republican idea, that it would get more support after 10 years after the failure of the BTU tax. But the fact of the matter is that it, in some respects, the tax is much more straightforward, and the only way you can get a carbon tax is, I think, by giving everybody something that they want, and people have talked about a swap of lower corporate income tax for a carbon tax. So we will see. The president hasn't talked about it at all, and it's very hard to imagine achieving something that important politically without the president putting his muscle behind it.
A lot of people have talked about the increase in extreme events over the last several years. There's been a renewed interest in Greenland and the melt there. What are you looking at these days?
Well, I think there's no question that the loss of Arctic sea ice is been happening decades faster than the climate models predicted, and the evidence is there's a bunch of feedbacks that haven't been, fully modeled. The reason that matters to you and I is that I think it is directly connected to the extreme weather, and I think that the fact that we've had now almost 3 consecutive years of just off-the-charts weather in the United States and around the world. I mean, in the last 2 years, we had 25 disasters that cost the United States $1 billion or more. I mean, it's really, really stunning. So I think to the extent that that kind of extreme weather is in fact here to stay, that is, starting to wake people up. Hurricane Sandy had a big political impact on a lot of people, in part because it hit the media and the elite where they live, as opposed to, let's say, poor people in Louisiana. And that's just the way of the world, unfortunately. People wake up to things when it hits them, not when it hits somebody far away that they don't really know. And then the indirect effect that will affect even more people is the effect on the food supply. Because a lot of those extreme weather disasters are devastating to our food supply. And right now, the drought that has, this staggering drought, really the worst drought in over half a century, is now continuing. And it's going to even expand or persist in large areas, and that's affecting already the winter wheat crop and corn and soy crops. So I think that something's got to give on the food side. We're going to have to, that'll be the first major system that has to change if we're to avoid, very serious problems in, let's say, 10 or 20 years.
And you have a new book, but it's not about climate. So what's up?
It's not a new book. Here it is. Language Intelligence, Lessons on Persuasion from Jesus, Shakespeare, Lincoln, and Lady Gaga. Well, I just have, in my spare time, for 20 years, been working on this book on persuasive communications. I've been studying the best communicators throughout history, and have finally synthesized the lessons into a book that a lot of people like, a very readable book. It's on track to be my best-selling book of all time. And Van Jones said it changed my life. It can change your life too. So I think anyone who wants to be more persuasive, a better communicator, would benefit from reading the book.
You have a beautiful young daughter. I have kids. My kids are a little bit older. What do we tell them?
Well, there is a famous, poster, or I forget what it was, a movie, what did you do during the war, Daddy? And I think you hopefully people will tell them I did everything I could, and it made a difference, and it helped make the future a little better. I would hate to have to explain to my daughter that I knew what was coming, and I didn't tell people what was coming. And I would hate my daughter to think that I knew that there were solutions that could be embraced today, and I didn't do my darndest to explain that to people. So I think that, and this gets back to President Obama's line about, not betraying our children and future generations. I think that, in 20 or 30 years, the biggest regret all of us will have if we don't stop, if we don't get on the path of aggressive mitigation soon, the biggest regret everyone's going to have is that we didn't do more. And all these other issues that we talk about, which are important at the deficit, Afghanistan, healthcare, these are very important issues. But, come the 2030s, when the world is desperate to avoid 7, 8, 9 degrees Fahrenheit warming, and dust bowls over a third of the habitable and arable lands, and sea level rise that, is going to be headed towards 4, 5, 6 feet this century and then just keep rising. When people are worried about that, I think anyone who didn't do everything in their power to warn people, to take action, people are that will be their big regret.